Have you ever had a guest sit down in your chair and say, "Well, I don't know what I want today"? Or maybe she pulls up 6 different Pinterest photos or Instagram or whatever, and they all look completely different from each other, or she just says, "I want something different," and offers you absolutely nothing else to go on. If you've been behind the chair for any length of time, you've probably smiled on the outside and thought on the inside, "Okay, we're going to be here for a while." And, I want to suggest something today that might completely change the way you see that moment, because I don't actually think your guest is confused about her hair. I think she's overwhelmed by making decisions. And if we don't understand what's really happening in her mind, it costs us far more than a longer consultation. It costs us trust. It costs us retail. It costs us retention. And sometimes it costs us the relationship altogether. Here's what I think most salon owners get backwards. We assume the consultation is about gathering information. It's not. It's about reducing uncertainty. Think about your own life for a second. Have you ever walked into a restaurant with a giant menu, like hundreds of options? Makes me think of like the Cheesecake Factory. There's pictures everywhere, and suddenly you can't decide anything. So you start asking the server, "What's good here?" And you're not actually asking what's good here. You're asking, "Can someone help me make this decision so I don't regret it later?" That is exactly what our guests are doing every single time they sit down. We've been taught for years that great customer service means giving people unlimited choices. Would you like this or maybe this, or what about this instead? But psychologically, more options don't create confidence. They actually create anxiety. And people don't come to us because they want more choices laid out in front of them. They come because they want clarity. And those are 2 completely different things to be selling.
Lindsay, I remember the exact moment this clicked for me, because I used to think being a great consultant meant asking a lot of questions like, what do you like? What do you not like? What are you thinking today? How short, how blonde, how warm, how cool? I had a whole checklist, and I remember I was so proud of that checklist, right? And while those questions do matter, I started testing something on the guests that I serve, because I wanted to know if the checklist was actually the reason that people kept coming back to me. So for a stretch of time, I tracked it. I paid attention to which consultations ended in a guest who booked her next appointment before she even left the chair, and which ones didn't. And what I found surprised me. It had almost nothing to do with how many questions I asked. It had everything to do with which question I led with. So instead of saying, "What do you want?" I started asking, "How do you want to feel when you leave here today?" Everything changed after that one question. The whole conversation moved from hair to identity. And once I saw the difference in my own numbers, I knew I'd never go back to the old checklist again. And here's why that question works so well. Think about the things that you've personally purchased recently. Maybe it's a vacation, maybe it's a new car, or a purse, a home, or just even a nice dinner out. Like, you weren't actually buying the object in front of you. You were buying the feeling you believe that object would create for you. Confidence, comfort, freedom, joy. The exact same thing happens in our chairs every single day. Your guest isn't buying highlights. She's buying confidence. She isn't buying extensions. She's buying possibility. She isn't buying skincare. She's buying hope. The service itself is just the vehicle that delivers the feeling. And once you see it that way, you cannot unsee it.
So true, and that's exactly why we became so passionate about color analysis inside our businesses, because it's the clearest example of everything Jen just described. Most guests don't speak the language of color. They don't know why one blonde looks incredible on them and another one washes them out completely. They just know sometimes I like my hair and sometimes I don't. And they've never once been able to explain why. When we become the expert in that room, we remove the uncertainty for them. We're not selling them a service at that point. We're giving them certainty. And certainty is what builds trust faster than anything else we do. And that leads to the bigger truth underneath all of this. Salon owners often believe they're selling hair. You're not. Hair grows, color fades, styles change with the seasons and with Pinterest and Instagram and all the trends. Trust is actually what keeps someone coming back to your salon for the next 10 years of her life. And so when a guest finally says to you, whatever you think, that's not laziness on her part. That is one of the greatest compliments she will ever give you. It means, I trust your judgment more than I trust my own opinion on this. That single sentence, whatever you think, is where lifelong guests are born.
So let's talk about what this is actually costing salons, because it's not what most owners assume. It's not guests who don't know what they want. That's not the expensive part. The expensive part is professionals who never became confident enough to lead the conversation. If you're always waiting for the guest to tell you exactly what to do, you've accidentally made her responsible for the outcome. But she's not the expert in that chair like you are. And the moment you forget that, the whole relationship shifts onto shaky ground. Here's a picture that always makes people laugh because it's so obviously true once you hear it. Imagine going to the doctor and saying, "Oh, doctor, my knee hurts." And the doctor responds, "Well, Jen, what surgery would you like?" You think, "What? Isn't that literally your job to tell me?" We laugh at that, but that is exactly what happens in salons every single day. We ask guests if they want warm or cool tones. Would you like to be warm or cool tone? And 99% of guests don't know the difference between warm and cool. Guests describe symptoms. Professionals are supposed to prescribe solutions. That's what professionals actually do for a living. And this doesn't just apply behind the chair, it applies to you as an owner too. Like, your team often doesn't know exactly what they need either. They know they're frustrated, they know they're overwhelmed, they know something isn't working, but they cannot always name it. Your job isn't simply to ask them, "What do you want?" Your job is to diagnose the real problem underneath what they're saying. That's leadership, and it's the same skill, just pointed at a different chair.
Yeah. So here's one of my favorite questions to hand you. I want you to actually try this one this week. Instead of asking, what would you like today? Try asking, if today turns out absolutely perfect, what would make you look in the mirror and say, yes, that's exactly how I wanted to feel? Notice what changes the second you ask it that way. You're no longer talking about inches or tone or foil placement. You're talking about identity. You're helping her describe the transformation, not just the transaction. Those are two very different consultations that lead to two very different outcomes. I believe the salons that create lifelong guests don't become successful because they do better hair than everyone else in town. They become successful because they reduce the uncertainty better than anyone else in town. They become guides, not order takers, trusted advisors, not technicians waiting for instructions. That's why guests keep returning for years and year after year, not because they remember every formula you ever wrote down for them, which is cool too, but because they remember how safe they felt trusting you with the decision.
Yeah. So here's our challenge for you this week. The next time someone sits in your chair and says, "I don't know what I want," don't panic, don't rush, and don't hand the decision straight back to her. Like, lean in, get curious, Help her discover the feeling she's actually searching for, because most guests don't need more options laid out in front of them. They need someone they can trust enough to lead them somewhere good.
Yeah. So if this episode made you think differently about consultations, share it with another salon owner or beauty professional today.
And if you're ready to build a salon where trust, not guesswork, is your greatest competitive advantage, that's exactly what we teach inside Salon Business School. Because the salons that grow the fastest aren't the ones with the most services on their menu. They're the ones that become the most trusted name in their market. And trust over time becomes everything.